Picture an empire at the peak of its power, dispatching 300,000 battle-hardened soldiers toward a neighboring kingdom. This was no ragged conscript force. These were experienced veterans of the mighty Sui Dynasty, marching in tight formation across the ancient landscape of East Asia in the year 612 AD. Their destruction would not come from armored cavalry charging across an open field, nor from volleys of arrows darkening the sky above them. It would come from something far more patient, far more silent, and far more devastating: a shallow river. The Sui emperor was consumed by territorial ambition. The kingdom of Goguryeo, occupying the Korean peninsula and parts of Manchuria, represented the final obstacle to his vision of total northern dominance. He assembled the largest military force the region had ever witnessed, and sent it marching northward, confident that sheer numbers alone would guarantee a swift and total victory. The blackened horizon, as that army moved forward, must have been a terrifying sight for anyone watching from the hills. Standing against this overwhelming force was Eulji Mundeok, one of the most gifted military minds of the ancient Eastern world. He looked at the numbers arrayed against him and made a clear-headed calculation. Meeting 300,000 hardened soldiers in open battle was not bravery, it was suicide. So he chose a different path entirely. Mundeok launched a scorched earth campaign of deliberate, systematic retreat. His troops pulled back from fortress after fortress, burning their own villages and stripping the surrounding countryside of every scrap of food and usable resource as they withdrew. They left the advancing Sui army nothing: no grain, no livestock, no shelter, no intelligence. Just empty, blackened land, and an enemy that kept chasing them deeper into hostile mountain terrain. The Sui commanders interpreted each Goguryeo withdrawal as evidence of weakness and cowardice. Every abandoned stronghold reinforced their conviction that total victory was imminent. Their confidence grew with each passing week, blinding them to what was actually happening. They were not pursuing a fleeing enemy, they were being drawn, step by deliberate step, into a trap with no exit. Months passed. The supply lines feeding the enormous Sui force stretched back hundreds of miles across difficult terrain, growing thinner and more unreliable with every week of advance. Soldiers who had set out proud and well-fed began collapsing from exhaustion along the mountain roads. War horses that had marched thousands of kilometers started dying beneath their riders. The great invasion machine was consuming itself from within. Mundeok watched the deterioration from observation posts high in the surrounding mountains, tracking the enemy's condition with the patience of a hunter who knows exactly when to strike. To accelerate the psychological collapse, he sent the Sui commanding general a poem, a pointed, mocking piece of verse that ridiculed the expedition's achievements and questioned the general's competence. It was a calculated act of psychological warfare, designed to humiliate, enrage, and destabilize whatever remained of Sui morale. It worked. The troops were already starving and exhausted. Now they were demoralized as well. Eventually, even the most stubborn Sui commanders could no longer deny reality. The Great Northern Campaign had failed. Orders were issued to turn back and begin the long march home. What nobody in the Sui ranks understood was that this retreat would carry them directly into the most lethal phase of Mundeok's plan, the phase he had been engineering from the very beginning. The retreating army dragged itself toward the Salsu River under a dim evening sky. For hundreds of thousands of exhausted, half-starved soldiers, the river represented the final barrier between them and the safety of home territory. They expected to find a deep, fast-flowing current, a significant obstacle that would take time and effort to cross safely. What they found instead stopped them in their tracks. The Salsu was almost completely dry. Where a powerful river normally ran, only a shallow knee-deep trickle remained, the rocky riverbed clearly visible beneath calm, crystal-clear water. To men who had been marching for months through mountains with almost nothing to eat or drink, this looked like divine mercy. The heavens had provided them an easy crossing home. Any remaining military discipline evaporated instantly. Soldiers threw down their shields and surged into the water by the tens of thousands, drinking greedily, pushing and shoving forward toward the opposite bank. Officers screamed orders that no one followed. The vast army that had once marched in disciplined formations now crowded the narrow riverbed in a chaotic heaving mass, completely exposed, completely disorganized, and completely unaware of what was waiting for them upstream. Several miles up the valley, hidden deep within the mountain gorge, sat the true heart of Mundeok's strategy. Weeks earlier, his engineers had constructed an enormous dam using earth, timber, and cowhide. Thousands of sandbags and reinforced barriers holding back the full force of the Salsu River. Millions of tons of pressurized water pushed relentlessly against the structure, straining to break free. Mundeok stood at the edge of the dam as darkness gathered over the valley. Below him, the entire Sui army was packed into the riverbed. An impossibly dense concentration of men, metal, and horses crowded into a narrow channel with steep banks on either side. He raised his sword. His engineers swung their axes into the tension ropes holding the structure together. The ropes snapped. The wooden supports buckled and gave way. The dam collapsed. The water that had been held back for weeks exploded through the gap with catastrophic force, transforming in seconds from a controlled reservoir into a roaring wall of destruction that thundered down the valley toward the riverbed below. The sound reached the soldiers before the water did, a deep, growing roar unlike anything they had ever heard. Men stopped drinking and looked upstream. Some tried to run. Their iron boots slipped on the wet rocks. The banks were steep and slick with mud. There was nowhere to go. The flood wall struck the packed Sui formation with the full accumulated force of a dammed river released without warning. It did not distinguish between officers and conscripts, veterans and recruits. It simply erased everything standing in the riverbed. The armored soldiers who had relied on their heavy iron breastplates for protection in battle found those same plates dragging them beneath the churning surface. Shields and banners tumbled through the current. The screaming was brief. A small number of soldiers, through luck or proximity to the banks, managed to haul themselves out of the water onto the muddy shoreline. Gasping and shaking, they had survived the flood, but Mundeok had planned for survivors too. Goguryeo cavalry burst from the tree line in a coordinated charge, driving into the scattered, weaponless survivors with arrows and blades. Those who had cheated the water died on the bank. Organized resistance was non-existent. The Sui army, which had set out as the most powerful military force in the Eastern world, ceased to exist as a fighting unit within minutes. Of the 300,000 soldiers who had marched so confidently toward Goguryeo months earlier, fewer than 2,000 made it back home. The Sui emperor's dream of northern conquest died in that valley, washed away with his army. The military and financial strain of this catastrophic loss, combined with the costs of previous failed campaigns, accelerated the internal pressures that would ultimately bring the Sui dynasty itself to an end just a few years later. General Eulji Mundeok secured his place in history not through the size of his army or the superiority of his weapons, but through the sophistication of his thinking. He understood his enemy's psychology, their arrogance, their impatience, their conviction that numbers guaranteed victory. He used that understanding to design a campaign that turned every Sui strength into a vulnerability. Their size made them impossible to supply. Their momentum made them easy to lure. Their desperation made them careless. And their blind rush towards safety made them walk willingly into a riverbed that had been weaponized against them. The Battle of Salsu River stands as one of history's most complete military upsets. A smaller defending force, annihilating an invader many times its size without ever engaging in a conventional pitched battle. Mundeok never gave the Sui army the fight it was prepared for. Instead, he gave it months of frustration, starvation, exhaustion, false hope, and finally a wall of water in the dark. The lesson carved into that valley floor has not aged. Overwhelming force without strategic intelligence is not an advantage. It is a liability waiting to be exploited. The Salsu River did not defeat the Sui army. Eulji Mundeok did. The river was simply his chosen instrument.